pleaded frantically for her children, but the black man pushed her out of the car and drove off with Michael and Alex. She ran to the nearest house, sobbing and crying for help. The family called 911.
Did he have any weapons, gun, anything?
He's got a gun.
Got a gun?
Yes, ma'am.
Within minutes, Union Sheriff Howard Wells was on the scene. He immediately notified the FBI and the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, known as SLED, a highly trained state police investigative unit. They dispatched agents to Union to assist the sheriff in the search for the alleged carjacker. Soon after, the boy's father, David Smith, rushed to Susan's side.
When I got there, she was hysterical. I had to literally pick her up off the floor and take her into the other room and sit down with her on the couch.
Later that night, David called his father.
I said, she ain't holding the bumper. I would have, they wouldn't have drove off with my kids. I was something when that car would have still been in my hand and he drove off, But there was never any doubt, in his mind that the kids were kidnapped.
I believed Susan. As I've stated before, 100%, completely. Never beyond that I didn't believe her beyond a shadow of a doubt, never.
David, like most people in Union, believed Susan Smith's story. By the next morning, word of the kidnapping had spread rapidly. Many residents would dedicate countless hours to a 9-day search for Michael and Alex Smith. A search that would end not in the safe return of the boys, but in the exposure of a lie that would shock the nation.
On the surface, there was little reason to doubt Susan Smith's story. By all accounts, she was a dutiful and loving mother. In high school, she had been a member of the National Honor Society and was voted friendliest girl by her classmates. But as the search began for the two little boys, the image of their tearful mother pleading for their safe return turned into a sickening lie. Police would later learn that 5 days before the disappearance of her boys, Smith had said to a friend, "I wonder what life would be like if I didn't have kids."
From the moment Susan Smith reported her children missing, a nationwide search began for her car. In South Carolina, officials led by State Police Chief Robert Stewart began a parallel investigation, as is commonplace in cases of child abduction. They questioned both Susan and David Smith, while following up on other leads about the supposed black carjacker. One of the problems complicating the search was that the description Susan Smith had provided for the composite drawing of the carjacker was so generic, it raised suspicion.
Of course, it had to be acted on because you have children's lives at stake. But over a period of a couple of days, we had some real concerns with that and with the concerns if it was false that it would cause in the community. And we tried to be very careful how we acted on that in conducting interviews of subjects based on her description.
A reporter with WIS-TV in Columbia, South Carolina, Heather Hoops, drove to Union to cover the story.
Discussion started right away about that composite and how vague it was and how it described half the people in Columbia and should we use it and what should be done. And eventually we pulled it off the air.
But the search for the carjacker and the little boys went on, and the residents did their part. They assisted police by printing thousands of missing posters, distributing photos, tying yellow ribbons around mailboxes and telephone poles, and scouting wooded areas on horseback. Local and national media descended on Union and beamed the story around the world. Before long, Susan appeared with her husband David to make a tearful plea for the return of their children.
I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't do anything but think about them. And I just want to hug him so bad and tell him I love him.
But doubts about Smith's sincerity grew rapidly. On the second day of the search, she took a lie detector test and failed. In an attempt to get a quick confession, police confronted Smith and accused her of being involved in the disappearance of Michael and Alex.
She immediately became belligerent, cursed the agent, and that was the end of it. So we knew she was the kind of person that we would have to very easily work into a confession. You couldn't intimidate her into it.
Nor could the authorities call off the search. Sheriff Wells, the FBI, and police kept on checking the hundreds of leads that came in every day. Susan and David Smith stayed with their families at the home of Susan's mother and stepfather, Linda and Beverly Russell, waiting anxiously for news.
It was very long days, very long, waiting out at the Russells, watching people come in, watching people go. You're like on a roller coaster, up and down, because there's so much hearsay.
On the third day of the search, there seemed to be a breakthrough. A car matching the description of Susan's Mazda was spotted in North Carolina. But it was not her car. In vain, divers searched the waters of John D. Long Lake from the shoreline to 100 feet out. And the FBI searched Susan's house, but came up with nothing. After almost a week of silence, Susan and David Smith appeared before the television cameras once again.
I want to say it to my babies that your mama loves you so much, and your daddy, these whole families love you so much. And you guys have got to be strong, because you are, I just know, I just feel in my heart that you're okay. But you got to take care of each other. And your mom and daddy are going to be right here waiting on you when you get home.
As the daily interrogations of Susan proceeded, police discovered inconsistencies in her story. The greeters at Walmart didn't remember seeing her on the night of October 25th. The friend Susan claimed she was going to visit wasn't even home that evening. And there were more.
She said there were no other cars in the intersection, no possible witnesses there, when in fact that light will only turn red for the direction she was traveling if there was cross traffic.
On day 8, Smith changed her written statement when police confronted her with new reasons why her version of the supposed abduction didn't add up.
It was like an elaborate chess match. She'd make a move, we'd make a move, until it finally got resolved.
The national media was now increasingly skeptical.
I would do live shots for stations around the country, and they were asking the question, well, hey, did they think the mom did it? It was a question that was on a lot of people's minds. Susan said things like, I loved them, I really did. Well, that's past tense. I mean, are they dead? Do you know something we don't?
On the 9th day of the search, Susan and David appeared on all 3 national network morning news programs, declaring their innocence and pleading for the return of Michael and Alex.
My first reaction is it hurts to know that that I would be accused or even thought that I would ever do anything to harm my children. As a mother, it's only a natural instinct to protect your children from any harm. And the hardest part of this whole ordeal is not knowing if your children are getting what they need to survive. And it hurts real bad.
Later that morning, Susan met with police behind a local church at a recreation center. Smith, worn down by day after day of intensive interrogations and relentless media scrutiny, finally broke down. It was in this small windowless room at about 2 p.m. on Thursday, November 3rd, that a tearful Susan Smith begged Sheriff Wells for his gun. She told Wells her children were not all right and fell to the floor sobbing. She said that the car and the children were at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Divers found the car 122 feet from the shore, upside down, under 18 feet of water. Through the murky darkness, the beam of a diver's flashlight illuminated a small hand pressed against the window. As the car was pulled from the water, the bodies of Michael and Alex were visible through the side windows. Back at the church, Susan Smith was allowed to prepare an unusual confession.
They wanted to get something in writing, but they didn't want to get into a situation with a confrontation to the point where they could get nothing in writing. So that's why she was allowed to, at that point, just write out her account of what happened.
In her written confession, Susan Smith claimed that she was suicidal on the evening of October 25th, that she was living in what she called a vale of tears. Not wanting her children to live without a mother, Smith said she was planning to kill herself and take her children with her. After driving around Union for over an hour, she pulled into the access road at John D. Long Lake. She let her car roll down the boat ramp, but soon stopped it by pulling up the emergency brake. Later, she got out of the car, released the brake, and let it roll down the ramp into the water. That evening, Sheriff Wells made the shocking announcement.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months.
I was heartbroken. It was a sickening feeling that I've never experienced in my life before. I felt empty. I felt hollow. I felt betrayed.
Later that night, as the car was removed from the lake, the bodies of her 2 children remained in their car seats, grossly deformed from being underwater for 10 days.
South Carolina decided to pursue the death penalty against Susan Smith. Her defense attorney would say that execution made no sense, since Susan wanted to die. And the worst punishment she could face was having to live with what she had done. Back in a moment.
The nation was stunned by the deaths of Michael and Alex Smith. Even more shocking was that the confessed murderer was also their mother. Crime statistics indicate that more than 1,000 children in the U.S. are killed each year by their parents. Susan Smith, having waived her right to a bond hearing, sat in jail as thousands of people streamed into the funeral home for the closed casket visitation of her 2 little boys. On Sunday, November 6, 1994, Michael and Alex were buried, their 2 small bodies placed in the same casket.
It was heart-wrenching. I mean, that was a tough one. I mean, I don't think there was a dry eye. It was 7 miles from the church to the funeral, and by the time we got to the burial site, the cars were still coming out of the church. It was the hardest thing I ever had to go through.
With the arrest of Susan Smith, the town of Union began to mourn as quickly as it had rallied to Susan's side. The yellow ribbons that had been tied to trees and lampposts were replaced with blue and white ones as a remembrance of the boys. The boat ramp at John D. Long Lake was transformed into a shrine for Michael and Alex. Overnight, the love for Susan Smith turned to hatred.
You need to cry!
They were ready to lynch her. I think the whole country was. They didn't have any answers for what she did. They couldn't understand how she would do something like this to their family member, and they wanted her hiding.
Many in the town of Union felt betrayed by Susan Smith, especially members of the African American community, since Smith had chosen to falsely blame a black man for the crime. On December 12th, Susan was indicted on 2 charges of murder. On January 16th, the Union County Solicitor, Tommy Pope, who would prosecute the Smith case, announced his decision to seek the death penalty.
The state of South Carolina hereby serves you with notice that the state intends to seek the death penalty in the above captioned case, State versus Susan Smith, indicted for murder, alleges that Susan Smith did in Union County on or about October 25th, 1994, feloniously, willfully, and with malice aforethought, kill one Alexander Tyler Smith by means of drowning, and said victim died as a result thereof. State of South Carolina versus Susan Smith, indicted for murder. That indictment was alleged that Susan Smith did in Union County on or about October 25th, 1994, feloniously, willfully, and with malice aforethought, kill one Michael Daniel Smith by means of drowning. Said victim died as a result thereof.
Smith was appointed a public defender named Judy Clark. Susan's mother and stepfather mortgaged their house to hire a second defense attorney with experience in death penalty cases, David Bruck.
The death penalty is, for her, beside the point. She says over and over again that she wishes she could just die so that she wouldn't have to hurt anymore.
Judge William Howard, who would preside over the case, set the ground rules in a number of pretrial hearings. He started by imposing a gag order on everyone involved in the case and ruling that cameras would be banned from the courtroom.
At the same time, the Simpson case was being tried and had started several months earlier, so we had the benefit of seeing what was going on out there. I felt every time I came into the courtroom that the level of anxiety that I saw was greater than I had seen before, and that it was affecting the way people were addressing the issues, the time that was involved.
The media coverage had been so intense, many believed it would be impossible to find a fair and impartial jury in Union. Under the law, defense attorney David Bruck could have requested a change of venue, but he decided that a local jury would most likely work to Smith's favor.
The prosecution's image of her was of a non-human, a Beelzebub-like character, of just unimaginable coldness and evil. And I thought it would be easier to sell that to a jury of strangers somewhere across the state than to a jury in Union County, because they would be asked to believe that this diabolical figure had grown up in their midst for 23 years and no one had noticed.
Jury selection began on Monday, July 10th. By Saturday, 9 men and 3 women had been chosen. 4 jurors were black and 8 white. Judge Howard sequestered them in a nearby hotel. He had set the stage for speedy and efficient justice. In comparison to the O.J. Simpson criminal trial, which took 9 months to reach a verdict, the fate of Susan Smith would be known in only 17 days.
With the guilty verdict all but inevitable, the real question in the courtroom was whether Susan Smith would face the death penalty. Next, the defense, with a clever move, takes control of the trial.
The trial of Susan Smith began on July 17th, 1995. It might have been a simple one, but the prosecution made what some believe was a major blunder. They decided to try and show why the defendant killed her 2 sons, even though the law did not require that they prove a motive, and they could have won without doing so. Each day, the Union courthouse was packed. Many more waited outside for a chance to get inside.
Not much of a mother. Whatever they do to her can't be enough. Anybody that could drown her babies, any mother could drown her babies, they've nothing to her.
Those who did get inside wouldn't hear Susan Smith speak, State psychiatrists had testified that although Smith was competent to stand trial, she was suicidal and might sabotage her own defense. Under South Carolina law, death penalty trials are divided into two parts. The first determines guilt or innocence. The second decides the punishment. The guilt phase of the Smith trial was essentially an open and shut case for the prosecution. In a written confession, Smith had admitted she had let her car roll into the lake with her children strapped in the back seat. There was little chance that Susan Smith would be found anything but guilty.
We didn't feel that there was any defense to the murder charge at all. So the best thing and the worst thing were the same thing, as we felt like there was going to be a murder conviction. The fact that within minutes of this crime she was telling a lie about what had happened to her children made it quite clear that she knew that it was wrong to have killed her children, and that, or at least that she would get in trouble for it. And that's the end of any insanity defense.
But the state wasn't taking any chances.
The defendant had extremely capable attorneys. They would test and they would push against our case. And if they met with resistance, they'd say, well, we're not contesting that. But if it was soft, I can guarantee you they would continue to push right through it. And so part of our job that a lot of people never realized was making sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed on each and every step.
As part of their thorough approach, prosecutors began the case with a motive. They argued that Susan Smith murdered her children in order to win back her wealthy boyfriend, Tom Findley, who was known throughout Union as the most eligible bachelor, lived in his family's mansion, worked for his father's company, and was Susan Smith's ticket to the good life. Much of the prosecution's case revolved around a letter that Findley had sent to Smith a week before the murders. In the letter, he outlined the reasons why he was ending their brief relationship. One of them was her children. Findley wrote, "There are some things about you that aren't suited for me. And yes, I am speaking about your children. I'm sure your kids are good kids, but it really wouldn't matter how good they may be. The fact is, I just don't want children."
When you've got a letter that says, you know, we could be together, but I'm not ready to have kids, I mean, you know, it's pretty clear-cut as I see it.
Under South Carolina law, the prosecution did not need to prove a motive to win a conviction in the murder case. They only had to prove it was premeditated by a mere second. Smith had conceded that in her own confession when she wrote, "I did go part way down the ramp, but I stopped. I went again and stopped. Then I got out of the car. I dropped to the lowest when I allowed my children to go down that ramp into the water without me."
Really, the state was going to get a murder conviction just for showing up. She had confessed to capital murder. We knew that the confession was not going to be thrown out. However, the state made the decision to try to prove motive at the guilt phase. We expected them to do it. We thought it was a mistake, but we thought it was a mistake they were going to make, and they did.
A mistake, according to Bruck, because it opened the door for the defense to present its own counter-argument about Smith's motive. That she was not a cold, evil killer, but a loving, immature, and troubled mother who could not cope with life. That the deaths of Michael and Alex were actually a result of Smith's botched attempt to commit suicide. An argument for which there was some evidence in Susan's past, according to the spokesman for the hospital, that evaluated Smith's mental fitness to stand trial.
Susan had been suicidal in high school to the point that she was briefly hospitalized in the psychiatric unit. Her father had committed suicide, and we know that individuals whose parent commit suicide, they're higher risk for suicide. These facts were brought out in the trial. Also, she had depression. It's plausible that she was very depressed that evening. She had been trying to get Tom's attention. He had been turning her off. This was very important to her.
Now that the door had been opened by the state, The defense walked right through it, presenting evidence of depression and alcoholism in Susan's family tree. The impact of her father's suicide when Susan was only 6 years old. And most shocking, the admission of sexual abuse by Susan's stepfather, Beverly Russell, head of Union County's Christian Coalition and chairman of its Republican Party. His abuse had begun when Susan was 15. The most recent incident was 3 months before the drowning of Michael and Alex.
We had the opportunity to show that on the available evidence, suicide was a much more likely motivating factor than a premeditated, cold, deliberate substitution of her children in favor of this remote chance of snaring a rich boyfriend.
So it brought out sort of the good with the bad. It toned it down and made it into a much more complex, emotional case right from the start, instead of allowing the state to portray it in a very stark, evil way and then have the defense try to reconstruct it in a different setting. The defense took control of the case with the state's first witness and never let go of it from that point on.
Because the defense was arguing that Susan's abusive past made her suicidal, but did not make her mentally ill, the prosecution was not allowed to have its own psychiatrists examine her.
That's one thing that makes those abuse defenses extremely difficult, at least under the structure of our law in South Carolina. It's the lack of an opportunity for the state. You know, you're basically using the defense of something unusual in the defendant's mind, but then you don't give us a chance to peer into their mind. It's almost like you putting up a witness and getting to get direct examination, but not allowing me to cross-examine them.
The defense psychiatrist did say Susan intended to kill herself and, quote, take her children with her, a point which the prosecutors really jumped on, saying, well, she didn't commit suicide, and you can't suicide a child. Now, it's plausible that someone could decide to commit suicide and take their children with them. This has occurred in other instances. However, her method here of committing, quote, suicide is very unusual. There are so many opportunities to get out. Now, her kids are strapped into the car seats. I mean, whatever's going to happen is going to certainly happen for them unless she rescues them.
The defense psychiatrist conceded something else about Susan Smith that for some members of the jury proved her guilt beyond any doubt.
His testimony led me to believe, yes, she is guilty. He said that she understood right from wrong. The way she made decisions was not rational, but she understood that it was wrong what she did. So she should be held accountable for what she did.
After a week of testimony, it took the jury only 2.5 hours to come back with a verdict. Guilty of 2 counts of murder. A verdict that didn't surprise anyone. But the defense had won a victory as well. It had presented evidence about Smith that might sway the jury against the punishment the prosecution was so eager to achieve: the death penalty.
To that end, the state would produce an unusual videotape that showed just how Susan Smith had drowned her 2 sons. The prosecutors wanted to prove to the jury that Smith had almost 6 minutes in which she still could have saved them. Back in a moment.
You tell us at aetv.com. On July 24th, the penalty phase of the Susan Smith trial began, with graphic and emotional testimony from both sides. The prosecution, in its bid for the death penalty, would visually recreate the deaths of Michael and Alex Smith. And the defense, in an effort to keep Susan Smith off death row, would use her friends and family to explore the most painful events of her life. The defense also had another argument against executing Smith.
I think it was clear that that life would be a more severe punishment for her because she loved those children. It sounds strange to say, but she did. And the full horror of what she had done weighed on her more heavily than on anybody else. And it was obvious that was going to stay with her for the rest of her life. The longer her life, the more she was going to hurt. And so the idea of the death penalty as retribution didn't really ring true for Susan.
But the prosecution was about to present a very compelling piece of evidence, hoping to sway the jury in its favor. In the months before the trial, Tommy Pope had prepared a video showing what would happen if a car like Susan's was allowed to roll down the boat ramp and sink in John D. Long Lake. The recreation was videotaped from the shore, while another camera was mounted in the car, roughly where Michael and Alex were sitting.
You got in your mind, well, it'll occur this way, or a car will drop like a rock, or it'll float forever, you know, all the different things. And ultimately, the byproduct of the testing, in addition to telling us some things about flotation characteristics, it gave us an internal view of how that car filled up with water, and basically gave us a view of what Michael and Alex would have been facing as the means of their death.
The defense objected to the video and requested that Judge Howard not let the jury see it. They claimed that the daylight and the divers floating in the water next to the car gave a false sense of rescue that Susan Smith, alone in the dark, would not have had. But the judge allowed it.
In the old game in which something could have been away in the courtroom, you're just sitting there watching that car float out in the water. It was really emotional.
David and I watched the reenactment. It was not shown to the court. We could sit and we watched it in the reflection of the windows because the blinds were drawn behind the jury, and we could sit there and watch it. It was very hard. It was heart-wrenching to watch that car just bob, and the front drop down and watch the car, because we just knew, you know, you could visualize Michael and Alex sitting there upside down, strapped in, nothing they could do.
Perhaps equally hard to watch was the testimony of the boy's father, David Smith, who described the monumental loss he had suffered when his children were murdered by his estranged wife.
Basically what we did was bring Michael and Alex back to life through David's testimony, with him telling about taking to the park and all the things that he'd done, and then having him relive their death. That's the first time in my career I'd ever broken down after testimony, and I talked to him and basically apologized to him for doing what we just had to do.
David's testimony had the courtroom in tears. Even Susan Smith, who throughout the trial had avoided all contact with her husband, whispered her apologies as she left.
She walked by and said, "I'm sorry." David just said it just infuriated him inside. You know, he was emotionally drained at that point, but it just infuriated him. She isn't sorry. I don't think she's sorry to this day.
The defense, hoping to counter the prosecution's emotional testimony, called friends, family, and social workers to testify on Susan's behalf. Her stepfather, Beverly Russell, took the stand, assuming responsibility for his sexual abuse of Smith and taking part of the blame for her actions.
The victim impact, so-called, ended up being much more in Susan's favor, because while David testified about his love for the children, so did everybody on Susan's side who were testifying for her. And it became clear that a death sentence was only going to increase the misery of the people who loved Michael and Alex Smith.
The jury agreed. On July 28th, after only 2.5 hours of deliberation, they unanimously voted to sentence Susan Smith to life in prison.
It was either death or life or innocent. So, you know, she obviously was not innocent. And I'd already made my mind up that based on the whole case, the death penalty wasn't warranted. So that was the only choice left.
I couldn't think it was all her fault. I mean, you know, it was, when it come right down to it, she was the one that she the one that committed murder. But
several things leading up to that, that she could have been helped before all this came about.
The people that were closest to her probably could have helped her before then if they had chosen to, but they didn't. And so she was left to keep going in the wrong direction with no help.
Susan Smith was remanded to the Women's Correctional Center in Columbia, South Carolina. Under state law, she is eligible for parole after serving 30 years. For the defense team, it was a victory that spared Susan Smith's life. For the father of the victims, nothing short of death would have been justice.
Well, first of all, me and my family, of course, are disappointed that the death penalty wasn't the verdict, but the jury, again, we respect that they took the testimony among themselves and they came back with the verdict of life, and so they returned the verdict they thought was justice. Of course, like I said, we are disappointed, but it wasn't our choice on what penalty she was to receive.
American justice had rendered its verdict. But it's not the business of the law to answer the far tougher question of why a mother would murder her own children.
I can't say that any theory of why this horrible thing happened makes sense, because murdering your own children like that, love, not